I want to talk about something that happened during Cleveland's minicamp coverage this week that I think cuts right to the heart of what's actually going on with this quarterback situation. And it's not the part most people are focusing on. There's a conversation circulating from Cleveland media insiders debating whether Shedeur Sanders or Deshaun Watson gives the Browns the better chance to win, and the disconnect between what some of these analysts are saying and what the actual evidence shows is genuinely striking to me. Because one side of that debate keeps reaching for what Watson was in 2019 and 2020, and the other side is pointing at what's happening in that building right now, today, in real time. And those are not the same conversation. Let me start with what we actually know from the minicamp, because the facts here are more interesting than the debate around them. Shedeur was out there taking snaps, running the offense, operating in Monken's system with the kind of comfort you only get from months of genuine preparation. The report from inside that facility tells you he'd been in the building all winter, in the coach's office, in the meeting rooms, in the film sessions, absorbing this playbook while others were elsewhere. And it showed. When you watch him move through the reads, when you see the decisiveness with which he's processing and pulling the trigger, that is not a quarterback guessing. That is a quarterback who knows where he's going before the snap and is just confirming what the coverage shows him. That preparation gap between Shedeur and the other quarterbacks in that room is not a minor detail. It's the whole story. Gabriel was out there too, and I want to be fair to him because the evaluation of what he showed is more complicated than a simple box score summary captures. The reports suggest he threw some interceptions, that his body language didn't project the kind of settled confidence you want to see from a player fighting for a job. And honestly, when you understand the context around Gabriel's situation, the reports that he wasn't in Cleveland during the offseason, that he expressed interest in moving on, the way he looked on that field starts making sense in a way that goes beyond football mechanics. A player who knows his future probably doesn't run through that building, and it shows when the game slows down and the pressure hits. He had some moments, but the overall picture wasn't a player who looked like he'd spent the winter fighting for the starting job. It looked like a player who had already processed the reality of his situation and was going through the motions of a formal competition that everyone inside that building understands has already been decided informally. Now here's the part of the media conversation that I genuinely cannot get past. There are analysts out there still building the case for Deshaun Watson by referencing what he was in Houston. And I understand the impulse. I really do. Because that player was genuinely special. The creativity, the mobility, the arm talent, the ability to extend plays and manufacture touchdowns from broken situations. In his best seasons, Watson was as good as almost anyone in football. Nobody who watched him in 2020 would argue otherwise. But here's the question I keep asking. Where is the evidence that any meaningful portion of that player still exists after 2 Achilles ruptures and a shoulder injury that has been described internally in terms that go well beyond normal recovery concern? Not where is the hope that it exists. Where is the evidence? Because hope and evidence are different things, and the people running professional football operations are supposed to be in the evidence business. The argument that gets made for Watson usually sounds something like this. His ceiling was higher than Shedeur's ever-proven ceiling, so the potential upside of Watson returning to form outweighs the risk of betting on an unproven young player. And on paper, that argument has a certain logic to it, but it collapses when you stress test it against reality. Because the Watson who produced that elite ceiling was a quarterback whose game was built around movement, around the ability to escape pressure, extend plays with his legs, create from broken pockets in ways that required a healthy, explosive lower body. 2 Achilles surgeries compromise exactly those qualities. Not theoretically, specifically, measurably, in ways that the medical staff inside that building has apparently characterized in terms serious enough that the coaching staff cannot build a competitive plan around his week-to-week availability with any reasonable confidence. You cannot invoke a player's peak mobility as the basis for his future value when the injuries he has sustained are specifically the ones that threaten mobility most directly. And then there's the circumstances argument around Shedeur that I think deserves real amplification because it gets mentioned and then dropped in most of the coverage without being properly developed. He went 3-4 last season without first-team reps. He was the only Browns quarterback to throw for over 400 yards. He made the Pro Bowl. Those numbers get cited and then immediately qualified. But it was only a few games, but the sample size is small. But he had mistakes. All of that is true. But nobody applies the same aggressive qualification to the Watson era, which featured far more games, far more sample size, and results that were catastrophically below expectation. The asymmetry in how the scrutiny gets applied is real, and I think it reflects something about how we evaluate quarterbacks that has more to do with pedigree and prior reputation than honest current evidence. What the minicamp conversation crystallized for me is the degree to which the Watson versus Shedeur debate has become a proxy for a deeper disagreement about how to evaluate quarterback situations. One camp is looking at what Watson did in the past and calculating whether enough of it survives to justify the continued investment of organizational resources. The other camp, the one that appears to include the actual coaching staff and the actual locker room, is looking at what is being demonstrated right now, daily, in that facility, and making their evaluation based on present-tense evidence rather than historical projection. And the present-tense evidence has been pointing in one direction consistently for months. Todd Monken saying publicly that rep distribution will not be equal is the coaching staff making their present-tense evaluation visible. The rep structure at minicamp, with Shedeur leading the first group and Watson working with the third unit, is the present-tense evaluation being operationalized. Myles Garrett and Denzel Ward speaking publicly about first service belonging to Shedeur is the locker room making its present-tense evaluation audible. And Shedeur himself, after practice, calling on the media and the fan base to bring the same energy the team is bringing, to match the belief inside that building with some of the same collective conviction is a quarterback who has earned the right to make that ask. He's not calling for blind support. He's pointing at what he's actually done and saying, look at the work and then decide. The Andrew Berry interview added some useful texture to the organizational picture, and I want to spend a moment on what he actually communicated versus what he didn't. Berry is one of the more precise communicators in NFL front office circles, and his answers around the draft and the quarterback situation were characteristically careful without being evasive. The best player available philosophy he described, where need and ceiling and risk profile all factor into the calculus differently depending on the specific situation, tells you Cleveland is operating from genuine flexibility rather than desperate constraint. They have 2 first-round picks, they have cap flexibility, they have options, and when organizations make decisions from that kind of position rather than from a corner they've been backed into, the decisions tend to reflect actual conviction rather than forced compromise. Berry's refusal to rule out veteran receiver additions after the draft, names like Tyreek Hill, Stephon Diggs, DeAndre Hopkins circulating in the conversation, is consistent with an organization that understands the infrastructure around the quarterback position needs to be built seriously. The draft is the primary vehicle for that construction. Offensive line investment, genuine receiver talent, the kind of weapons that force defensive coordinators to make difficult choices rather than allowing them to load the box and scheme against a limited offensive identity. But the acquisition season doesn't close when the draft ends, and the openness about potential veteran additions suggests Cleveland is thinking comprehensively about what this offense needs to give Shedeur a real environment to develop in. The discussion around Carnell Tate at pick 6 has been the dominant mock draft conversation around Cleveland, and I think the case for him is actually pretty compelling when you understand what Monken's system specifically wants from the wide receiver position. He's described as wanting size, physicality, and speed, receivers who can run the full route tree and create separation at multiple levels rather than just operating as slot specialists. Tate's profile fits that description in ways that explain why his name keeps coming up in Cleveland-specific projections. Whether he's actually there at 6 depends on how the board unfolds, but the fit is genuine rather than speculative. The offensive line conversation is more nuanced than the simple need equals address it framing suggests. Barry's comments about what Cleveland accomplished in free agency, Titus Howard at tackle, Zion Johnson at guard, Elton Jenkins with versatility across the line, suggest the organization believes it has built a functional foundation that doesn't necessarily require a first-round tackle selection to be competitive. That framing opens up options at 6 that a pure needs-based approach would foreclose. If the tackle class is deeper than consensus suggests, and veteran free agent additions have addressed the immediate floor concern, the argument for taking the best available player, regardless of position, becomes stronger rather than weaker. What I keep coming back to when I think about everything happening in Cleveland right now is how different the organizational environment feels compared to previous quarterback situations this franchise has attempted to build around. The difference is visible in how the coaching staff talks, how the locker room communicates publicly, how practice is structured, and how the front office describes its decision-making philosophy. None of those things individually constitute proof of anything. But their consistency, all of them pointing toward the same player, the same organizational conviction, the same present tense evaluation producing the same conclusion, creates a picture that is harder and harder to argue against honestly. Shedeur Sanders went into that minicamp as the quarterback who had spent the winter in the building while others were elsewhere. He left it having reinforced everything the organizational signals had been suggesting, that the informal competition has a clear leader, and the formal competition is structured around confirming rather than discovering that reality. The Watson debate will continue in the media because it always does, because there's a natural human tendency to want to believe that investment can be recovered and that what was great can become great again. But inside the Cleveland Browns facility, in the meeting rooms and on the practice field, and in the rep distribution decisions that coaching staffs use to communicate organizational direction in the language that football people actually speak, the conversation appears to have moved considerably past that debate. And what it has moved toward is a young quarterback who showed up ready, kept showing up, and has been proving every single day since he arrived that the circumstances of how he was acquired have nothing to do with the player he actually is.